Um, this is the second part of our Vietnam War handout. Last time we were looking at what the Special Intelligence Estimate Study and kind of like what was the airstrike effect, like what we're going to do. So this is the next little part. So this is the short problem. So the proposed bombing. So in real life, LBJ went through with a bombing strike of some sort. We're going to learn about that right now. So it is April 65, and you are President LBJ. In South Vietnam, a group known as the Viet Cong currently fighting a guerrilla war against the South Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong are communists, and they have the support of North Vietnam, as well as Communist China and the Soviet Union. The U.S. has become involved in the conflict because it wants to stop communism from spreading, a policy known as containment. We know that already. That started in the 1950s under Truman. The South Vietnamese appears to be losing the war, and if this keeps on happening, communism is going to affect all of the country. And so the U.S. has bombed North Vietnam, but only kind of a few targets and not a whole lot because they don't want to get China super involved. And so it's now you have to decide whether to initiate a full-scale bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese, or and that's because the U.S. has already started bombing in South Vietnam to support U.S. and Vietnamese troops, but they haven't gone to North Vietnam. And so the Viet Cong draw most of their military support from the North Vietnamese, including equipment, training, and several thousand soldiers. So called a meeting. You've called a meeting to make a decision. Below the arguments your advisors have made about whether the U.S. should bomb North Vietnam. So, one, bombing won't cost a lot of American lives, will raise morale in South Vietnam and with the government, help U.S. avoid getting drawn into a ground war, so sending troops over. Two, limited bombing may encourage the North Vietnamese to negotiate, so if we punch them in the mouth, hopefully they'll come to the table and negotiate. The Joint Chiefs of Staff strongly favor all-out bombing. They feel the U.S. should use all the power to inflict whatever damage it can on the enemy. They believe that the object of war is to defeat the enemy and then negotiate from a position of strength. So I'm going to completely beat you up. Then we'll talk about it instead of like kind of punch you a couple times, do something like that. Number four, 60% of Americans like the bombing of factory bridges and all that stuff in North Vietnam. So you have the American public on your side. Government studies show strategic bombing didn't work really well in World War II, and the cost to the country doing the bombing was far greater than the economic cost of the mission itself. Then, like, kind of the damage that was done. It won't work in Vietnam either. And then six, bombing could draw the U.S. deeper into conflict, increase South Vietnam's dependence on U.S. China into the world, and turn world opinion against the U.S. Also, North Vietnam will likely send more troops into South Vietnam and intensifying the war. So, um, questions. This is just recap from last week, but answers to the questions: how effective is the U.S. Air Force? And that first question asked, the U.S. has the best Air Force in the world and should be able to hit nearly any target it chooses. However, the North Vietnamese do have an air defense system that could threaten U.S. planes in certain areas if China and the Soviet Union provide North Vietnam with more sophisticated air weapons. or surface-to-air missiles. It could be dangerous to bomb certain targets. And then second question, what does the U.S. know about North Vietnamese will to continue fighting? Will the Viet Cong surrender or compromise if the U.S. bombs them and hurts the North Vietnamese economy? The North Vietnamese are determined to seize control of South Vietnam. They have been fighting since 41, first against the Japanese and the French, and now the South Vietnamese government. In addition, they believe Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, would have won the election in 56, which would have given them control of the entire country. They feel like they feel like they would fight to the death. The government surveys about strategic bombing World War II shows that people's will to fight strengthens after the country has been bombed, so that the North Vietnamese will to fight may increase as well. So they're saying, okay, like we can fight them, but their will might grow, and we can see that with the UK during the bombing of London, that after that, the British were like, okay, we're ready to fight World War II. And so it actually strengthened. So there's that answer. Are there many good targets, such as factories in North Vietnam? The answer is no. They're very underdeveloped. Modern economy has just modern economy and has just a few factories, oil tankers, and easy identifiable targets. Um, North Vietnam has some railroads and bridges. The U.S. could bomb to cut off transportation, but the supply of obvious targets will run out after a few months. So it's not like the United States where you look, there's factories, there's roads, there's railroads, all that stuff. It's like we're a very developed country compared to Vietnam, and so it's just there's not a whole lot. Will China or the Soviet Union get involved in the war? There's no evidence that this is true, but however, indirect evidence shows that if U.S. bombs North Vietnam, China and the Soviet Union would likely support North Vietnam more by sending troops, economic relief, and will just make it as difficult as possible on America. And then there's that. Those were the answers to the questions. So here's what happened. So the bombing of North Vietnam. So President Johnson decided to actually gradually squeeze and then talk. So I'm gonna punch you a little bit. Are you done? No. Okay. Punch, 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 punch. Are you done yet? No. And then just roll it up. And this was called Operation Rolling Thunder. And this didn't succeed at all. So the president's advisors didn't look at the perspective of the North Vietnamese. And had they done so, they would have seen that North Vietnam could counter all bombing attacks by the U.S. And the North Vietnamese had an extensive defense system, including surface-to-air missiles, to shoot down the planes. So North Vietnam was mainly agricultural. It had very few factories to begin with, and the North Vietnamese relocated industrial production, warehouses, barracks, and other targets next to hospitals, schools, essentially saying it's like, hey, if you're going to bomb one of these places, you're going to have to bomb a school. You're going to have to bomb a hospital. It's essentially like someone's robbing a bank and they hold like a hostage. Like they hold a hostage with a gun. It's like, hey, if you shoot me, like I'm gonna shoot this person. And so that's what the North Vietnamese are doing. Um, and so I kind of lost my place. Drop the bombs the U.S. dropped cost more till than the targets bombed, and so this is just like, okay, I'm gonna shoot a missile and try to hit I'm gonna try to hit a fly off of a horse or something with this missile. It's like it's not that advantageous to try to kill that. And then the Institute of Defense analyzed or Analysis issued a report in 1966 stating that the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam had no measurable effect on the country since few rewarding targets existed in North Vietnam, and the will to fight seemed to remain just as strong, if not stronger. The bombing didn't affect the Viet Cong in South Vietnam either, and that's mostly because the Viet Cong support developed most of their stuff from the local area. President Johnson didn't realize, but the U.S. military had played a war game, an exercise which tests the outcome of a hypothetical scenario involving bombing North Vietnam before going ahead with the actual bombing. The war game produced the same results that the actual bombing did. The North Vietnamese countered all U.S. attacks despite the negative results of the war game. The military went ahead with the bombing anyway. So this is hey, it's kind of Albert Einstein's hey, if doing the same thing more than once and expecting a different result, it's that's insanity. It's yeah, we're going crazy here. We essentially didn't look at what we did previously with these war games, and now we have this. The U.S. dropped 3 times as many bombs during Vietnam as it dropped in World War II, and were dropped on South Vietnam. The U.S. used air power to support its soldiers in combat, and the combat took place in South Vietnam. Heavy bombing left craters that made parts of North and South Vietnam look like the moon. Unfortunately, the craters filled with stagnant water that increased the mosquito population, which led to the spread of malaria. So, it's U.S. kind of made Vietnam a whole lot worse by spreading malaria, by having the stagnant water, just destroying places, destroying crops, all that. And so here's the problem. Let me see if. Yeah, okay, so we're going to 58. Okay. I was just making sure. So the problem. So it is July of 65, and you're still LBJ. The U.S. has about 23,000 military advisors in Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese fight the communists. However, the South Vietnamese are losing to the Viet Cong. You now have to decide whether to send large numbers of regular U.S. combat forces to Vietnam to defeat the Viet Cong. In the U.S., people have protested against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict, but polls repeatedly show that a majority of Americans support a larger U.S. military role in Vietnam. So people are hey, we need to get more involved. We need to stop communism. We've kind of bought into this containment. This past June, General Westmoreland and Maxwell Taylor reported that if the North Vietnamese continue to defeat the South Vietnamese in battle, the will of the South Vietnamese to continue to fight will erode. So it'll just they're going to give up. Westmoreland requested up to 100,000 additional U.S. combat troops to prevent defeat and create more active U.S. role in the war. And you've called a meeting to decide once and for all whether to send a large number of troops to Vietnam. These are the following arguments made in the meeting. So, argument A. Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs William Bundy says that the lessons of the 1930s and the Korean War show that the U.S. must take a stand to stop communist expansion. In the 1930s, Britain and France failed to take a strong stand against Nazi Germany, especially when Britain gave away part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. This policy of appeasement only led to further German expansion and ultimately World War II. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the former ambassador to South Vietnam, claims that if the U.S. does not fight in Vietnam, it risks getting pushed into a World War III. In the Korean War, the U.S. Stood up to communist North Korea's attempt, which China and the Soviet Union backed, to conquer South Korea. Some of your advisors tell you that the U.S. made the right move in using military force to save South Korea, and that the Korean War probably deterred further communist aggression, which is an interesting take. U.S. State Department advisor George Ball argues that the conflict in Vietnam is not like the Korean War and has offered the following reasons to back up this assertion or this claim. One, the Korean War began with a massive invasion across an international border. The conflict in Vietnam is a civil war. The Viet Cong have garnered a great deal of support for the people of South Vietnam. So the war is more of an internal rebellion than an invasion. Two, in 1950, the U.S. Korean government under leader Syngman Rhee, I probably said that wrong, was stable and had widespread support. The current South Vietnamese government is in chaos and does not have broad support from the people of South Vietnam. So this government that we're helping isn't even popular among the people. But we're going to force this compared to what South Korea had. The Korean War, and this is number 3, the Korean War started just 2 years after Korea gained its independence. Ball claims that the Korean people were still excited by their newfound freedom. They were fresh they were fresh for the war and willing to fight. In contrast, the South Vietnamese have been fighting for almost 20 years, first against the French and now against the North Vietnamese, according to Ball. And they're tired of conflict. They're just like, we just want to get done with this. Argument C. The experience of the French from 1945 to 54 shows that the Viet Cong will take heavy punishment rather than give up their objective of taking South Vietnam. As a result, the U.S. may not be able to defeat the Viet Cong without suffering unacceptable losses. The French fought in Vietnam for 7 years with 250,000 combat-hardened veterans supported by an army of a little bit over 200,000 South Vietnamese, and they couldn't win. Moreover, if the U.S. sends a large number of troops to Vietnam, it will give the appearance of a white man's war. That is, a war against non-whites that would turn international opinion against the U.S. The U.S. would encounter the same problem in Vietnam that the French did, difficult in collecting intelligence, overestimating the usefulness of sophisticated weapons in jungle warfare, and experience serious dissonance within its ranks. So they're saying like this war is going to be long, people are going to like just break rank, soldiers are just going to like mutiny kind of. George Ball feels the US should emphasize negotiations and push for a coalition government in South Vietnam that would include the communists. He argues that the US should not escalate its military involvement in the war, but instead should negotiate to end it. Argument D. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and Secretary of State Dean Rusk argue that the present situation in Vietnam is unlike that of France faced in 54. Unlike the French army, the U.S. won't use defensive tactics that give the initiative to the communists. The war lacked popular support in France, and the country had an unstable political situation. In contrast, the U.S. has a stable, unified government with your party, the Democrats, in control of both houses in Congress, and widespread support for its policy of keeping South Vietnam independent. One additional difference: the French fought in Vietnam to prevent independence. The U.S. will fight to defend independence. So it's like we're always flag waving Americans. We'll always support freedom. Like we will be on the side of good. That kind of rhetoric with McBundy and Rusk, or McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk. Argument E. Former President Eisenhower says that your first duty is to prevent a communist takeover of Vietnam. If the communists do win, other countries in Southeast Asia will fall like dominoes to communism. Communist China will expand its influence in the region and may even take or even try to take over some other countries. So former President Eisenhower is like, hey, it's the domino theory. It's like if this country falls, then Laos, then Cambodia, then all of this, and it's like it's just going to be awful. And so this is coming from a former president. Argument F. Army Chief of Staff Harold Johnson, who has recently returned from Saigon after you sent him there to appraise the situation, reports that it would take 500,000 troops, 500,000 troops, for 5 years to win the war. He says that normally the U.S. would send a 10-to-1 numerical superiority to defeat the Viet Cong, who have an estimated 200,000 soldiers at this point. But the powerful weaponry of the United States has the U. But the powerful weaponry the U.S. has would make up the difference. You called together or that's like essentially argument F is we're only going to send 500,000 troops to defeat the South Viet Cong because usually we need 10-to-1, which for that we would need 2 million troops to defeat the 200,000 Viet Cong. But he says because we have a technological advantage, that makes up that difference, which I'm like, okay. Argument G. You called together a group of World War II leaders, including General Omar Bradley and former Secretary of State Dean Axion, whatever, to get their advice on whether to send large numbers of troops to Vietnam. This group, referred to as the Wise Men, bring with them the historical perspective of the 1940s. All of them except one told you that the U.S. should send all troops necessary to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. Argument H. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara believes the U.S. needs to send the troops General Westmoreland requested in order to prevent defeat and turn the tide of war in favor of the South Vietnam. When the U.S. has a stronger position on the battlefield, it can persuade North Vietnam to end the war. According to McNamara, if the U.S. doesn't send these troops, it could lead to a surrender on the installment plan. Keep on going down. Argument I. Secretary of State Rusk says that your advisors almost unanimously agree that the U.S. must honor its commitment to fight to save South Vietnam. The integrity of the U.S. commitment, Rusk says, it is the principal pillar of peace throughout the world. If that commitment becomes unreliable, the communist world would draw conclusions that would lead to our ruin and almost certainly to a catastrophic war. If it may take a long time, but the U.S. can defeat the Viet Cong. Argument J. Clark Clifford, a longtime informal advisor, believes that sending troops is a bad idea that could turn into a major problem. An open-ended commitment of U.S. troops would, without a realistic hope for victory, the terrain or the geography and political situation of Vietnam makes this war fundamentally different than the war in Korea. Argument K. A lot of arguments. Senator Richard Russell, whom many regard as the most influential and widely respected member of the Senate, and who is chiefly responsible for your selection as Democratic leader when you served in Congress, speaks to you for or 5 times a week in person or on the phone. He says that sending troops in Vietnam would hurt the U.S. and help the communists. The jungles of Vietnam are terrible places to fight a war, and the Viet Cong would easily be able to use guerrilla tactics to pin down U.S. troops. Russell says that Vietnam has no strategic, economic, or tactical value, and the U.S. can never win. So, the question is, will you here it is right here. Here it is right. Will you approve sending large troops of American combat troops into Vietnam? And so then you can ask two of the following questions. One, how popular is the South Vietnamese government? What is the Vietnam situation in South Vietnam? How strong are the two sides? What do leading experts say about the stability and popularity of the South Vietnamese government? Or four, can the U.S. get advice from a political scientist about the difficult situation like this? So your assignment is to ask the two questions and tell me why. Um, like, just tell me why you chose those two questions instead of the other two, and just kind of answer that, and then also pick a argument that you kind of agree with or resonate with. So that's kind of your assignment. Hopefully this helps. Again, if you need any help, let me know, and I'll kind of make another video if you need me to, or all that. Okay, bye.